Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. Please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you. Craig insists that the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves the finitude of the universe, and Craig insists on this despite the fact that one of the authors of the theorem has said that Craig's interpretation is incorrect. This is insane! Are you kidding me? Tell me, Dr. Craig, do you think that Jesus will forgive you for all of the lying that you do on his behalf?
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is the world's foremost Christian apologist, namely William Lane Craig. Now you might be asking yourself, what the hell can this nobody YouTuber bring to the table when critiquing such a juggernaut? Well, I hope to bring something to the table today, but as per usual, dear listener, you can be the judge. What we're going to discuss today is the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument that made William Lane Craig famous. Aside from discussing some of its more obvious flaws, what I want to do today is highlight what I believe to be, sincerely, the soft underbelly of Craig's apologetics. So where is this soft underbelly, you might ask? In order to expose it, it's necessary to take an all-encompassing or synoptic view of Craig's theology. If you take a macro perspective, the soft underbelly is revealed for all to see. So what follows then is an exploration and comparison of various clips and public appearances which, when compiled, reveal the hypocrisy, contradiction, and untenability of Craig's claims. By way of analogy, I think of Craig like a man lost at sea in a leaking lifeboat. The problem for Craig is that the boat is leaking at both ends, and his arms and legs aren't long enough to plug both gaps simultaneously, nor does he have any materials with which to plug the respective gaps. Needless to say, this is an unwinnable dilemma, because no matter which gap Craig plugs, the boat is still sinking. But I'm undoubtedly guilty of speaking too abstractly in this moment. I'm using analogies and metaphors. So let's dispense with all of that and dive right into Craig's argument, and I will show you in no uncertain terms the soft underbelly that I've referred to.
Ghazali formulates his argument very simply. I quote, "Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning." Ghazali's reasoning involves three simple steps. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. Premise two, the universe began to exist, from which it follows three, therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning.
And there you have it, the Kalam in all of its glory. The question is, does it work? Well, for an argument to succeed, it must be both valid and sound. Validity goes to the structure of a syllogism. An argument is said to be invalid if its conclusion can be false when its hypothesis is true. An example of an invalid argument is the following. If it is raining, then the streets are wet. The streets are wet, therefore it is raining. Clearly, this is invalid, because it's possible that the streets are wet due to a broken fire hydrant, or kids playing with water guns, etc. So while rain certainly wets the street, it doesn't follow that it rained just because the street is wet. Ergo, the argument is invalid. The hypothesis or opening premises of the argument are true, yet the conclusion does not follow. As for the Kalam, it's clear that the argument is in fact valid. Why? Because if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. Think about it. If it's true that beginning to exist entails a cause, and if it's true that the universe began to exist, then it follows deductively that the universe has a cause. No question. But remember, for an argument to succeed, it must be both valid and sound. Soundness applies to the truth of the premises. And therein resides the debate. Is it true that if the universe began to exist, it must have a cause?
Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning.
And is it true in the first place that the universe began to exist?
The universe began to exist.
Let's deal with these in order, shall we? First, is it true that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning? Some may be tempted to grant this premise as a kind of metaphysical first principle. Some may grant it based on intuition alone. But when it comes to Craig, it's worth noting that he doesn't hold to this causal principle in every case. Consider this. Craig believes that God is causeless, which is to say that God relies on nothing else for his existence, a so-called non-contingent being.
This cause must itself be uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible.
Yet, simultaneously, Craig also believes that God had a beginning in time.
Time must have had a beginning, and that in some mysterious way God existed not before time, that would be a self-contradiction, but he existed in some way beyond time. And so the way I would put it is this, is that God is timeless without creation, and he is temporal since the moment of creation. So the decision to create on God's part is a decision to enter into time, to take on a temporal mode of existence in order to relate to his creatures.
Wait, what? But I thought if something has a beginning in time, this meant that said something has a cause.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning.
Yet, here we have a causeless, non-contingent God who began in time.
God is timeless without creation, and he is temporal since the moment of creation.
So on Craig's own view, which is to say, by his lights, it's possible for something to begin to exist and not have a cause of its existence. This is where Craig's soft underbelly begins to show. You see, if Craig sticks to the Kalam and the Kalam alone, his argument seems much more reasonable. After all, isn't it obvious that if something begins to exist, it must have a cause of its existence? But if you broaden your view and you take a macro perspective of Craig's theology, again, the soft underbelly begins to show, because Craig doesn't hold to this view. Something can begin in time and yet not have a cause. His very own God fits this description. Needless to say, theists will quickly respond with some assertion about God and how special he is, about how God is an exception. But responses like these are textbook cases of special pleading. In other words, Craig sets up this metaphysical rule whereby beginning to exist entails a cause, but in the next breath, he violates this exact same rule by suggesting that God has a beginning in time, yet he exists causelessly. Again, this is special pleading, plain and simple. So as I see it, Craig has two options, neither of which are home runs for his faith. Option A is for Craig to abandon this thesis, namely that beginning to exist entails a cause, in which case the naturalist can allege that the universe began to exist causelessly, or that the universe has both a temporal and non-temporal phase just like God. This would be a major defeat for Craig, as it would render the Kalam a defunct entity. After all, abandoning the idea that beginning to exist entails a cause is to abandon the first premise of the argument. So Craig may not be a big fan of this option. Option B is for Craig to consistently apply the causal principle, in which case Craig would have to concede that God beginning in time entails that God has a cause as well, in which case God loses his ultimacy, his non-contingency, his divine aseity, etc. This is a non-starter for Craig and theists more generally, but pick your poison. Worse still, and counterintuitive though it might seem, even if we grant Craig this idea that the universe is finite towards the past, it still wouldn't follow that therefore the universe had a beginning. As the always awesome Joe Schmid, aka the Majesty of Reason, put it when he appeared on my channel,
merely from the fact that all of physical reality is finite towards the past, it doesn't follow that it began to exist. And the reason for that is because there are various additional conditions on beginning to exist that you need to meet in order to count as beginning to exist, in addition to having a finite past. So the way to see this is to take Craig's own view. God has a past, and his past is not infinite. He has a finite past. God has a finite past. But Craig does not say that God began to exist. That shows that having at least in Craig's view, and the way that he formulates this argument, the way that he understands beginning to exist, and the way that you need to understand it for the argument to succeed, that shows that having a finite past is not sufficient for beginning to exist, because God has a finite past, God has existed in time for a finite period, going back to a definite starting point, and yet, God did not begin to exist. You can take similar views about physical things. So, for instance, you can agree that all of physical reality is finite towards the past. Doesn't follow that all physical reality began to exist, because maybe some physical entity existed causally prior to the beginning to the beginning of time. Maybe it existed causally prior to the beginning of time in a timeless state. And in fact, there are various physically live proposals for how we can understand physical things, like the universal wave function, for instance, existing non-spatiotemporally. There are physically live models of that. It's talked about in philosophy of physics, etc. And so, again, even if the Big Bang showed that all of physical reality was finite towards the past, it would not follow that all of physical reality began to exist.
But the problems don't stop there. The idea that the Big Bang has conclusively shown that the universe had an absolute beginning is nonsense. But don't take my word for it. Have a listen.
So the right answer is we don't know yet. And if you look at sort of the cosmological models that professional cosmologists are bandying about, some of them feature a beginning, a true first moment in time. But increasingly, many of them don't feature a beginning at all. They have an eternal universe that lasts infinitely far into the past and will stretch infinitely far into the future. We use the phrase, the Big Bang, to refer to that earliest moment of the history of the universe where we don't understand what is going on. It's a placeholder for our lack of understanding.
You know, we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. So that's a measurement. So because we can measure the speed that all the galaxies are flying away from us, essentially. And then you can run time backwards, if you like, to find out when they were all on top of each other. And so it's quite a simple measurement, and we've done that. So we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. But actually, all we know really was the universe was very hot and very dense at that time. And we have some theories that the universe was in existence before that, and perhaps some sort of circumstantial evidence. And that means that actually the universe could have always been there, eternal.
So you see, it's not a foregone conclusion that the universe had an absolute beginning, despite what Craig would have us believe. But no matter how many times Craig is reminded of this fact, he insists on ignoring it. And this is truly egregious in places. For example, Craig insists that the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves the finitude of the universe. And Craig insists on this despite the fact that one of the authors of the theorem has said that Craig's interpretation is incorrect. This is insane! Are you kidding me? If you can't see the soft underbelly at this point, dear listener, I can't help you. Despite this correction, Craig continues to trot out this lie that the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that the universe has a finite past. This is absolutely atrocious. But once again, don't take my word for it. This transpired during the now infamous debate between physicist Sean Carroll and Craig. Have a listen.
Now, you might think that, there's a theorem by Alan Guth and Arvin Bordet and Alex Vilenkin that says the universe had a beginning. I've explained to you why that's not true, but in case you don't trust me, I happen to have Alan Guth right here, one of the authors of the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Alan, what do you say? He says, I don't know whether the universe had a beginning. I suspect the universe didn't have a beginning. It's very likely eternal, but nobody knows. Now, how in the world can the author of the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem say the universe is probably eternal for the reasons I've already told you? The theorem is only about classical descriptions of the universe, not about the universe itself.
According to Craig's own YouTube page, this debate occurred on Friday, February 21st, 2014. Yet, and once again, according to Craig's own YouTube page, here's Craig repeating the exact same defunct claims in March of 2015. little over a year after having been corrected on this egregious error. Have a listen.
In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. That goes for multiverse scenarios as well.
I'm sorry, folks, and I hate to do this. I'll undoubtedly be accused of an ad-hominem after saying what I'm about to say. But here I go in vain. Think of the dishonesty that's on display here. Craig was incontrovertibly, undeniably, unquestioningly, unequivocally corrected on his misuse of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. But here he is, a little over a year later, still spreading the same misinformation. Tell me, Dr. Craig, do you think that Jesus will forgive you for all of the lying that you do on his behalf? But the fun doesn't stop there. Consider how Craig responds to challenges that are levied by the audience. Have a listen.
In the last 30 years or so, it has been shown experimentally that in quantum mechanics you can have creation without a cause of, you mentioned it, subatomic particles. And at the very beginning of the universe, as you also said, the universe itself was subatomic. Why is it so inconceivable that the mechanisms that work now didn't work back then?
So to summarize, the questioner wants to know why Craig is so certain that the universe couldn't just pop into existence in the beginning, especially when one considers the nature of quantum mechanics, an area where particles do just that. After all, posits the questioner, wasn't the universe incredibly small in the beginning, the size of a particle or perhaps even smaller? So surely it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the universe could have popped into existence. We're not talking about the universe popping into existence in its current form, massive. We're talking about a universe popping into existence that would be the size of a quantum particle or smaller. For what it's worth, I think this is a good question. I mean, Craig wants us to buy into the idea that popping into existence in a causeless fashion is metaphysically absurd.
Therefore, for the whole universe to come into being without a cause is to come into being from nothing, which is absurd.
He wants us to buy this because if we don't, then God's role in creation is nullified. So the questioner has put his finger on something pivotal. A lot rests on Craig's response here, for if he fails to demonstrate that popping into existence causelessly is absurd, then premise one of the Kalam is in jeopardy. And here's how Craig responds.
The reason is that in the so-called quantum creation of subatomic particles, you always have a material substratum, a physical system from which these emerge. For example, the quantum vacuum is not nothing, as the layman might think when he hears the word vacuum. It is a sea of roiling energy, and the particles come out of the vacuum, so that the vacuum is the cause of the existence of these particles. In the case of the universe, however, as we just discussed a moment ago, we have an absolute beginning of all physical reality, so that there isn't any sort of prior thing that could serve as a quantum substratum for the creation of the universe.
And there you have it. Craig dispars an inference from 1. The causeless nature of quantum mechanics to 2. The possibility of a causeless universe. On what grounds, you ask? Well, therein resides the beautiful inconsistency of Craig's theology. Get ready to see that beautiful and soft underbelly, folks. Craig dispars this inference on the grounds that quantum particles pop into existence within a vacuum.
The quantum vacuum is not nothing, as the layman might think when he hears the word vacuum. It is a sea of roiling energy, and the particles come out of the vacuum, so that the vacuum is the cause.
Whereas the creation of the universe, vis-a-vis creatio ex nihilo, involves the popping into existence of the universe out of literal nothing.
In the case of the universe, however, as we just discussed a moment ago, we have an absolute beginning of all physical reality, so that there isn't any sort of prior thing that could serve as a quantum substratum for the creation of the universe.
Oh, I see, Dr. Craig. So you mean that it's improper to infer something about the nature of nothingness based on the nature of somethingness? Or to put it another way, Craig is arguing that it's inappropriate to infer anything about absolute beginnings based on beginnings that emerge out of something like a vacuum in space-time. The problem is, Craig engages in this exact kind of inferential reasoning in other contexts. Like I said, folks, you broaden your view to the macro level, and Craig's theology begins to fall apart. What the hell am I referring to? Guys, we're talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, the first premise of which suggests that the universe's beginning demonstrates that it had a cause. How does Craig support this premise? Well, therein resides the soft underbelly. Craig supports the first premise of the Kalam with reference to the everyday objects we see around us, objects which had causes and beginnings. In fact, Craig routinely claims that the universe must have a cause based on the fact that everyday objects within the universe have causes. But don't take my word for it. Here's Craig pointing this out himself.
When we look at things that begin to exist, we find they inevitably have causes. So it would be a good inductive inference from our sample class of things that begin to exist to infer that whatever begins to exist has a cause.
And there you have it, plain as day. Craig wishes to use his everyday experience of caused objects in the world in order to form an inductive inference about the likelihood that the universe also has a cause. Can you not see the hypocrisy here? So atheists are not allowed to infer that the universe began causelessly based on the causeless nature of quantum mechanics, because such an inference ignores the distinction between coming into being out of literal nothing versus coming into being out of something, such as a quantum vacuum. Yet, Craig is entitled to infer that the universe has a cause based on the causal nature of objects within the universe, and this despite the exact same distinction, that is, the universe coming into being out of literal nothing versus the objects within the universe coming into being out of something. So you see, Craig is having it all his own way here. When he wants to establish the idea that there exists a cause for the universe, Craig is more than happy to use objects that are created out of something in order to infer the idea that the universe was created out of nothing. But when he wants to dispair the idea that the universe exists causelessly, suddenly Craig alleges that it's inappropriate to use objects that are created out of something in order to infer the idea that the universe exists causelessly. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the use and abuse of inductive reasoning, and Craig's soft underbelly is now exposed for all to see. When it suits him and his theology, Craig is more than happy to draw inferences from the natural world and how it behaves. But when that exact same natural world produces inferences which conflict with his theology, Craig is quick to point out that the natural world cannot be used to infer anything about the nature of things prior to the universe's existence. This is utterly unacceptable. I dare say that this is a textbook case of motivated reasoning, where Craig is desperately trying to preserve his God as opposed to following the chain of reasoning where it leads. As I see it, and in order to be consistent, Craig has two options here. And both options come with a rather bitter pill. Option A is for Craig to embrace the possibility that space-time can be used to infer things about the nature of reality prior to the universe's creation. This allows Craig to infer the idea that the universe has a cause based on the fact that objects within the universe have causes, assuming we want to ignore the compositional fallacy that would be created by using such reasoning. But with that exempted, what's the bitter pill here for Craig? Well, Craig cannot dismiss the possibility of a causeless universe on this view, because quantum mechanics gives us reason to believe that particles can in fact pop into existence in a causeless fashion. Remember, with option A, Craig cannot disbar this inference on the grounds that it compares space-time with reality prior to the universe's creation, because the whole point of option A is to embrace the possibility that space-time can be used to infer things about the nature of reality prior to the universe's creation. So in order to be consistent, Craig would have to bite the bullet here. But in so doing, Craig would be admitting that beginning to exist does not entail a cause, a deeply problematic conclusion for Craig and his faith. Option B is to reject the possibility that space-time can be used to infer things about the nature of reality prior to the universe's creation. This allows Craig to block the inference to a causeless universe based on quantum mechanics, because even though quantum mechanics gives us reason to believe that particles can pop into existence in a causeless fashion, such observations are irrelevant because one cannot infer anything about the nature of reality prior to the universe's creation based on the behavior of things within space-time. Or to paraphrase Craig, one cannot infer anything about absolute beginnings based on beginnings that emerge out of something like space-time. But yet again, and unsurprisingly, this option comes with a bitter pill. If indeed Craig deems it inappropriate to use objects which emerge out of something in order to infer anything about so-called absolute beginnings, then Craig's use of caused objects within the universe cannot be reasonably marshalled as evidence for the conclusion that the universe has a cause.
When we look at things that begin to exist, we find they inevitably have causes. So it would be a good inductive inference from our sample class of things that begin to exist to infer that whatever begins to exist has a cause.
So if Craig takes option B, he can't establish that the universe has a cause, and his Kalam cosmological argument fails. That said, and to be fair, it's possible that Craig could establish a cause for the universe using some other philosophical argument or evidence, but at the very least, his inductive argument either fails or it provides good reason to believe in a causeless universe, neither of which Craig wants. So by now, the sinking lifeboat analogy is manifest and obvious. As you can see, no matter which option Craig takes, the boat is still sinking. Suffice to say, dear listener, while the Kalam is valid in structure, the soundness of the premises is deeply questionable. And Craig himself appears to be impervious to correction on the matter. How Christian of him. It's extremely clear to me, and I hope now to you as well, that Craig uses and abuses inductive reasoning. He's more than happy to draw inferences from space-time when it suits his theology, but he wants to ignore those exact same inferences when it doesn't suit his theology. Special pleading. The Christian's best friend and bedfellow. I dare say that without it, Christian apologetics would never have gotten started in the first place.